December 7th, 1943. A biting wind swept across the Allied prisoner transfer station near Liverpool, England, as sleet pelted down from a leaden sky. Sergeant James Holloway of the United States Army Air Forces pulled his wool coat tighter, watching as 24 captured German soldiers were led from trucks to a temporary holding facility. The Americans had been told these prisoners would be processed and sent to camps in Canada by morning. What Sergeant Holloway could never have anticipated was that his simple act of kindness toward one of those shivering men would set in motion a chain of events that would alter his fate during the most perilous moment of his life. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable true story of how an unexpected moment of compassion between enemies would transcend the barriers of war, revealing how individual humanity could survive even within the mechanized brutality of the greatest conflict in modern history. The prisoner transfer station near Liverpool was a converted wool warehouse, cavernous, drafty, and perpetually damp. Allied military police maintained strict protocols for handling enemy prisoners, processing over 8,000 Germans through this facility in 1943 alone. Sergeant Holloway, temporarily assigned to the station while recovering from a non-combat injury, observed the process with detached interest. At 26 years old, the former Pennsylvania steelworker had already completed 12 bombing missions over occupied Europe and was scheduled to return to active duty in just 3 weeks. "They look half frozen," remarked Corporal Walter Dennison, another temporary assignee standing beside Holloway. "Standard procedure," replied Lieutenant Frank Garrity, the officer overseeing the transfer. "Minimal comfort during transport makes them more compliant during processing." Among the German prisoners, one man in particular caught Holloway's attention. Unlike the others, who huddled together for warmth, this prisoner stood slightly apart, shivering uncontrollably. He was young, perhaps 20, with a gaunt face suggesting recent weight loss, but it was his eyes, alert, observant, strikingly intelligent, that made him stand out. "That one there," Holloway said, gesturing discreetly. "What's his story?" Lieutenant Garrity consulted his clipboard. "Oberfeldwebel Werner Keller, Luftwaffe, shot down over the Channel last week. Intelligence already questioned him. Says he was a mathematics student before the war." As Holloway watched, the young German airman stumbled slightly, catching himself against the wall. His thin summer weight uniform was soaked through, offering virtually no protection against the December cold. "Lieutenant, permission to issue that man a blanket?" Holloway asked. Garrity shook his head. "Supply shortage. We're already 137 blankets below allocation. They'll get proper gear once they reach the permanent camp." That night, as Holloway tried to sleep in his quarters, he found himself thinking about the German airman. According to the processing schedule, the prisoners would be departing at 0500 hours for the transatlantic journey, nearly 6 hours in the cold, before boarding the ships. Military protocol was clear: maintain professional distance from enemy combatants. But something about the young mathematician's quiet dignity had resonated with him. At 04:15, Sergeant Holloway arrived at the holding facility carrying a brown paper package. The night guard, Private Jenkins, raised an eyebrow. "Early for your shift, Sarge." Holloway nodded toward the cells. "Just wanted to check something before transport." Inside, most of the German prisoners were sleeping on the hard benches or floor. The mathematical airman, however, sat awake, arms wrapped around himself for warmth, staring at nothing in particular. When Holloway approached the cell, those intelligent eyes immediately fixed on him. "Oberfeldwebel Keller," Holloway said quietly, careful not to wake the others. The German's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise at hearing his name and rank. "English?" Holloway asked. "Yes, some," the German replied in a hoarse whisper. Holloway unwrapped the paper package, revealing his spare wool coat. It was not a regulation coat, but one his mother had sent from home. Dark brown with wooden toggles, lined with flannel. He passed it through the bars. "For your journey," Holloway said simply. "It gets cold on the Atlantic." The German airman stared at the coat, then back at Holloway, clearly confused by the unexpected kindness. "Why?" he asked. Holloway considered this for a moment. My brother was a prisoner in North Africa last year. Someone helped him, that is all. The German hesitated, then accepted the coat with a slight nod. Danke. Thank you. Werner, Holloway said, using the man's first name deliberately. The war will end someday. Remember, there are good people on both sides. With that, he turned and left the holding facility, dismissing the incident from his mind. He had done what felt right in the moment, nothing more. By the time he began his shift 2 hours later, the prisoners had already departed. The German airman and the coat were just another small episode in a global conflict involving millions. 3 weeks later, Sergeant James Holloway rejoined the 427th Bomber Group at their airbase in eastern England. The massive airfield housed over 70 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, each representing the pinnacle of American industrial capability. The average bomber contained 300,000 individual parts, weighed 32,000 pounds fully loaded, and cost over $300,000 to produce, a staggering sum in 1943. "Good to have you back, Hollywood," said Captain Daniel Morris, using Holloway's squadron nickname as they walked toward the briefing room. "Here you were babysitting Krauts while we've been doing the real work." "Just temporary assignment during recovery," Holloway replied. "How many missions did I miss?" 7. Lost 4 planes, 17 men. Morris's matter-of-fact tone barely concealed the emotional toll. "But production is up. 27 new crews arrived last month. The assembly lines back home are running 24 hours now." The scale of the American war effort was becoming apparent. In 1943 alone, American factories would produce over 29,000 aircraft, more than Germany's total production for the entire duration of the conflict. This industrial disparity was beginning to shape the course of the air war over Europe. Holloway resumed flying missions in January 1944. The Allied bombing campaign had intensified, with round-the-clock raids targeting German industrial centers. American bombers flew by day, British by night, giving the German defenders no respite. For the flight crews, each mission was a calculated gamble with survival. The average bomber crew member had a 1 in 4 chance of completing a full tour of 25 missions without being killed, wounded, or captured. On February 12, 1944, Holloway's bomber, Pennsylvania Polly, joined a massive raid of 357 aircraft targeting aircraft factories near Leipzig. Lieutenant Edward Connors, the pilot, gathered his crew for the pre-mission briefing. "Target is heavily defended," Connors explained, pointing to the map. 327 known anti-aircraft positions. Intelligence estimates 160 enemy fighters in the area. We'll have Thunderbolt escort for the first 300 miles, but they'll have to turn back due to fuel limitations. We'll be on our own for the most dangerous portion. Holloway, as radio operator and waist gunner, would be responsible for maintaining communications and defending against attacks from the side. The crew had completed 16 missions together, developing the wordless coordination that often meant the difference between survival and disaster. The mission began like countless others: the thunderous roar of engines at takeoff, the gradual climb to 27,000 feet, the formation taking shape as hundreds of bombers assembled in the cold, thin air. But as they crossed into German airspace, everything changed. The enemy response was immediate and overwhelming. "Fighters, 3 o'clock high," shouted the top turret gunner through the intercom. Within minutes, the sky filled with German Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, slashing through the bomber formation. Ahead, Holloway watched as a B-17 erupted into flames, breaking apart before beginning its long fall. Another took a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire, losing its right wing and spinning wildly out of formation. Pennsylvania Polly shuddered violently as anti-aircraft shells exploded nearby, sending shrapnel tearing through the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft. One engine began smoking, then a second. Lieutenant Connors struggled to maintain control as the bomber began losing altitude. "We're hit bad," the flight engineer shouted. "Hydraulics gone, oxygen systems compromised, can't maintain altitude." "Prepare for emergency landing," Connors ordered. "Radio, send distress signal with position." Holloway transmitted their coordinates, knowing that in enemy territory, it was likely only the Germans would receive the message. Below, The snow-covered landscape of central Germany stretched endlessly. As the crippled bomber descended through 10,000 feet, Connors spotted a level field that might serve as an emergency landing site. The landing was violent but controlled. The aircraft skidded across the frozen field, finally coming to rest at the edge of a small forest. Remarkably, all 9 crew members survived, though 3 suffered injuries severe enough to impede movement. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before patrols arrive," said the navigator, checking his service pistol. Standard procedure: destroy sensitive equipment, split into teams, head west. The crew quickly divided what few supplies remained and prepared to separate. Holloway paired with the tail gunner, Sergeant Paul Martinez, who had a badly sprained ankle but could still walk with assistance. "See you all at the officers' club back home," Connors said. The traditional farewell among aircrews facing separation in enemy territory. No one acknowledged the statistical improbability of such a reunion. For 3 days, Holloway and Martinez moved west by night, hiding in barns and forests by day. They avoided roads and settlements, subsisting on emergency rations and melted snow. The February cold was their greatest enemy, with temperatures dropping well below freezing each night. Martinez's injury worsened, his ankle swelling until he could barely hobble even with Holloway's support. On the morning of the 4th day, they were awakened by the sounds of dogs barking and men shouting in German. They had been discovered. Within minutes, they were surrounded by 8 soldiers in field grey uniforms, rifles pointed at their chests. A German officer stepped forward. "American airmen, you are now prisoners of war. You will be treated according to Geneva Convention." They were transported to a temporary holding facility, a schoolhouse converted for military use. There they joined dozens of other captured Allied airmen, most from recently downed bombers. After brief questioning, they learned they would be transferred to Stalag Luft III, a specialized camp for captured Air Force personnel located in eastern Germany. The journey to Stalag Luft III took 3 days, traveling in overcrowded train cars with minimal food or water. By the time they arrived, Martinez's ankle had become infected, and he was immediately taken to the camp infirmary. Holloway was processed into the general population, photographed, issued a prisoner number, and assigned to a barracks. Stalag Luft III housed over 10,000 Allied airmen by early 1944. The camp was divided into separate compounds based on nationality, with American and British sections being the largest. Despite the hardships, the prisoners had established remarkably organized communities with educational programs, theatrical performances, and even sporting events. "Fresh meat," remarked an emaciated British officer when Holloway entered his assigned barracks. "Welcome to the Paradise Resort, Yank. I recommend the north-facing accommodations for their exquisite view of barbed wire." The gallows humor was a necessary survival mechanism. Holloway quickly learned the rhythms of camp life, the twice-daily roll calls, the perpetual hunger, the constant surveillance. The guards were mostly older men or those deemed unfit for frontline service, with varying degrees of strictness. The camp commandant, a Luftwaffe colonel, generally ensured adherence to the Geneva Convention, though conditions deteriorated steadily as Germany's war situation worsened. 2 weeks into his captivity, Holloway noticed a German officer observing him during morning roll call. The officer consulted a clipboard, then spoke briefly with one of the guards, who nodded in Holloway's direction. That afternoon, Holloway was summoned to the camp administration building. "Sergeant Holloway," the camp translator said, "the assistant security officer wishes to speak with you." Holloway was led to a small office where a German officer stood looking out the window. When he turned, Holloway was startled to recognize the mathematical airman from Liverpool, Werner Keller, now wearing the uniform of a Luftwaffe intelligence officer. "Sergeant Holloway," Keller said in surprisingly good English, "I thought it might be you when I saw your name on the new prisoner manifest." Holloway stood at attention, offering only his name, rank, and service number as required by military protocol. Keller smiled slightly. "Please, sit. This is not an interrogation. That part of your processing is complete." He opened a drawer and withdrew a familiar item, the brown wool coat with wooden toggles that Holloway had given him 2 months earlier. "I believe this belongs to you," Keller said, placing the coat on the desk between them. Holloway stared at the coat in confusion. "I don't understand. You were a prisoner." "I was," Keller confirmed, "and then I was not. The realities of war are sometimes complicated." The German officer explained that he had indeed been a prisoner briefly, but as a mathematics specialist with particular knowledge of navigation systems, he had been part of a prisoner exchange arranged through neutral Switzerland. Upon his return to Germany, he had been assigned to intelligence work at this camp due to his English language skills. "Your coat kept me alive during that journey," Keller said quietly. "The transport ship was unheated. 2 prisoners in my compartment did not survive the crossing due to exposure. Your unexpected kindness preserved my life." Holloway remained silent, uncertain how to respond to this extraordinary coincidence. "Now," Keller continued, "I have an opportunity to repay that kindness. Your fellow airman, Sergeant Martinez, his medical situation is quite serious." "How do you know about Martinez?" Holloway asked. "I review all medical reports, camp procedure." Keller leaned forward. "The infection in his ankle is spreading. Our camp medical facilities are limited. Without proper antibiotics, amputation will become necessary within days." The statement hung in the air between them. Amputation in a prisoner camp with primitive surgical facilities often meant death from shock or secondary infection. "What are you suggesting?" Holloway finally asked. "I can arrange for proper medication to be provided," Keller said carefully. "Not standard procedure, but possible. I can also arrange for you to be assigned to the infirmary to assist in his care." "Why would you do this?" Keller touched the coat. "Because you were right, Sergeant Holloway. There are good people on both sides. The war will end someday, and we will all have to live with what we did and what we failed to do." True to his word, Keller arranged for sulfanilamide medications to be provided for Martinez's treatment. He also secured Holloway's temporary assignment to the infirmary, where he could help care for his crewmate. Over the following weeks, Martinez gradually improved, eventually regaining his ability to walk without assistance. Keller visited the infirmary occasionally, ostensibly for inspection purposes. During these visits, he and Holloway developed a cautious rapport, always careful to maintain appropriate boundaries between captor and prisoner. They never discussed military matters, instead finding common ground in discussions of literature, music, and mathematics, Keller's academic passion before the war. "My professor at Heidelberg had an elegant way of explaining differential equations," Keller remarked during one such conversation. "He said they were like describing the shadow of a moving object. You cannot see the object itself, only its effect as it passes through time." "Like the war," Holloway responded. "We experience its effects, but the full shape of it will only be visible afterward." Keller nodded thoughtfully. "Precisely. And when that complete shape is finally visible, I fear many in my country will be shocked by its true form." As winter gave way to spring, conditions at Stalag Luftretreat worsened. Food rations decreased as Germany's transportation systems suffered under intensified bombing. News of the war came sporadically through new prisoners and the occasional smuggled radio. Allied forces had landed in Italy, and rumors of a larger invasion somewhere in Western Europe circulated constantly. In early June 1944, the camp dynamics shifted dramatically. Most of the senior German officers were reassigned, replaced by SS personnel with little regard for the Geneva Convention. Rations were further reduced, and punishments for minor infractions became increasingly severe. Keller remained, but his authority had been diminished. During this period, Holloway noticed Keller appeared increasingly troubled during his inspections. On June 10th, the German officer managed a brief private conversation while Holloway was working in the infirmary. "Things are changing," Keller said quietly. "New orders from Berlin. The camp is to be evacuated soon." "Evacuated to where?" Holloway asked. "Further east, away from the advancing Allied forces." Keller's expression was grave. "The journey will be difficult, especially for the sick and injured." 3 days later, the camp commander announced that all prisoners would be relocated within the week. Each man would be allowed to carry only what he could hold in his hands. The prospect of a forced march in summer heat, with already weakened prisoners, was alarming. That night, Keller appeared at the infirmary after hours, carrying a small leather satchel. "Sergeant Holloway?" he said urgently. "I have been reassigned, effective immediately. I leave in the morning." Before Holloway could respond, Keller handed him the satchel. "Inside you will find civilian clothes, food rations, maps and documents, identification papers for a Danish worker. They are not perfect, but they may suffice." Holloway stared at him in shock, immediately understanding the implication. "You're suggesting escape." "I am suggesting survival," Keller corrected. "The evacuation orders, they are not motivated by military necessity. The SS officers now in command have different priorities than safeguarding prisoners." He explained that 5 men from the infirmary, including Martinez, could feasibly attempt escape through a drainage culvert near the northwest corner of the camp. The area would be minimally guarded that night due to reassignments. "Why are you doing this?" Holloway asked. "It's treason against your country." Keller was silent for a long moment. "When you gave me your coat in Liverpool, you acted according to your conscience, not your orders. I am doing the same." He touched the brown wool coat he still wore. "Perhaps this is its purpose, to remind us both of our humanity." That night, Holloway and Martinez, along with 3 other injured men capable of limited mobility, made their escape through the drainage culvert. Using the maps and forged papers provided by Keller, they navigated cross-country, avoiding main roads and checkpoints. The civilian clothes allowed them to blend with the numerous displaced workers moving throughout the region. For 2 weeks, they traveled westward, hiding by day, moving by night. Twice, they narrowly avoided German patrols. Once they were helped by a Polish farmer who provided shelter in his barn during a rainstorm. The forged papers identified them as Danish technical workers, which explained both their accents and their lack of fluency in German. On June 26th, they encountered an advance reconnaissance unit of the American 7th Army. After careful verification of their identities, they were transported to an Allied field hospital, then evacuated to England. By mid-July, Holloway and Martinez had returned to the United States, their war effectively over. James Holloway returned to Pennsylvania, resumed his pre-war job at the steel mill, and rarely spoke of his experiences. Like many veterans, he preferred to focus on rebuilding his life rather than dwelling on the past. He married his high school sweetheart in 1946 and had 3 children over the next decade. In 1961, Holloway received an unexpected letter postmarked from West Germany. Inside was a brief note. "Dear Sergeant Holloway, I hope this finds you well. After many years, I have finally located your address through the Red Cross records. I am now a mathematics professor at the University of Munich. If you ever visit Germany, I would be honored to meet again under better circumstances." The coat, I'm afraid, did not survive the final days of the war, but its lesson remains with me always. Sincerely, Werner Keller. Enclosed with the letter was a black and white photograph of Keller with his wife and 2 young children, standing in front of a modest home. On the back was written, "The family that exists because of a coat and the good man who shared it." Holloway and Keller maintained correspondence for many years afterward. In 1968, during a European vacation with his wife, Holloway finally visited Munich. The 2 former enemies, now friends, spent a long afternoon walking through the rebuilt city, reflecting on the strange circumstances that had connected their lives. "You know," Keller said as they sat in a cafe near the university, "I have often wondered what would have happened if our positions had been reversed, if you had been captured first and I had been the one to find you in the camp." Holloway smiled. "I believe the result would have been the same. The coat would have found its way to whoever needed it most. The small act of sharing a coat with a shivering prisoner, a moment that took less than 5 minutes on a cold December morning, had created ripples that altered the course of multiple lives. It demonstrated how, even in humanity's darkest chapter, individual compassion could transcend the artificial boundaries of conflict. In the years following the war, historians would document the staggering statistics. Over 60 million dead, entire cities reduced to rubble, industrial slaughter on an unprecedented scale. Yet alongside these grim figures exist countless undocumented stories like that of Holloway and Keller, moments when individual humans chose connection over division, compassion over indifference. Werner Keller continued teaching mathematics at the University of Munich until his retirement in 1983. Among his students, he was known for an unusual tradition. Each winter, he would select one struggling student and present them with a brown wool coat with wooden toggles, a replica of Holloway's original gift. The student would be told only that the coat represented an important lesson about mathematics and humanity. Only those who asked for the story behind the coat would learn its true significance. For his part, James Holloway rarely mentioned the coat or his wartime experiences to his children. It was only in his later years, when his grandchildren began asking questions for school history projects, that he shared the story of Werner Keller and the extraordinary coincidence that had saved his life. In 1992, when the Berlin Wall had fallen and Germany was reunified, Holloway received a final letter from Keller's son, informing him that the former German officer had passed away peacefully at the age of 70. Among his personal effects was a handwritten note requesting that the brown wool coat he had worn in recent years, another replica of the original, be sent to his American friend along with his mathematics medal from the University of Munich. The coat arrived at Holloway's Pennsylvania home 2 weeks later. Pinned to it was a simple note in Keller's handwriting: "The circle is complete. May this remind all who hear our story that humanity exists even in the darkest times." James Holloway passed away in 1997, having lived to see his children prosper and his grandchildren begin their own journeys. At his funeral, his oldest son shared the story of the coat and its journey between enemies and friends. The original coat was long gone, but its legacy continued through the stories told by both families on opposite sides of the Atlantic. In 2010, Werner Keller's grandson and James Holloway's granddaughter, both historians, collaborated on a book documenting their grandfather's extraordinary connection. During their research, they discovered additional details neither man had fully shared. Military records confirmed that the SS officers who took command at Stalag Luft III had indeed planned to execute a number of prisoners during the evacuation, including those in the infirmary. Keller's actions had not only helped 5 men escape, they had almost certainly saved their lives. The most remarkable discovery, however, came from Keller's personal journals. In his final entry, written just days before his death, the mathematician had reflected on the central lesson of his life. The complexity of war can be reduced to a simple equation: hatred divides, but compassion multiplies. A single act of kindness, even toward an enemy, creates possibility where none existed before. This is the ultimate defiance against the machinery of conflict, to remember that beneath uniform and flag exists a fellow human whose life holds equal value to our own. Holloway understood this when he gave his coat to a shivering enemy. "The coat warmed my body, but the lesson warmed my soul for a lifetime." Today, a small exhibition in the International Red Cross Museum in Geneva features a replica of the brown wool coat with wooden toggles, alongside photographs of Holloway and Keller in their later years. The display bears a simple caption: "Individual acts of humanity cannot stop wars, but they remind us why wars must be stopped." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.